My name is Bill Sutherland from the Zoology department. It's my great pleasure to be chairing this event, which I'm sure you're all aware of. It's a joint event by CRASSH and CCI. And we've been delighted to have Gretchen here for the last few days, doing our best to kill her by endless events. She seems to be surviving remarkably well, so we're going to have even more talks and even more dinners next time we do this. So, as we discovered quite how tough these speakers are. Our plan for today is very much to have an open discussion. That's why we reorganized the room to encourage that. We're going to have a series of responses. The idea is that 3 people are going to give their view on some aspect of something that Gretchen said. And they're going to explain what Gretchen said. So if you didn't go into that lecture, there's some seats here, Nigel. If you didn't go to the lectures or miss some of the lectures, it doesn't matter. That will all be explained. And then after coffee, we're going to try an experiment. The last experiment like this I tried was a complete disaster, so it can only get better. So we'll see. I'm sure it'll work well. What we're going to ask people to do is write a statement about something to do with this subject. And it might be something that's supporting, something that's critical, a statement of what needs to be done, future research directions, a confession, whatever you want to say. Just have a statement. And ideally, if people could submit these on a piece of paper, you could write, there's some blank sheets at the back. You can write them on the blank sheets if you want. Ideally, if you could give them in, we'll go through some of them at coffee and then read some out and then ask you to stand up and then describe why you said that. And then we'll have a discussion. We thought it might, rather than just coming back and continuing the discussion, we thought it might make it a more interesting discussion. And if not, we'll just go and have some drinks early. But I'm sure we'll find interesting things to say. So we're going to start off with a series of 3 discussions, 3 responses. After each, we're going to invite you to chip in and make your comments. Describe what you think. And Gretchen's also going to respond. I think probably not immediately. We might have 1 or 2 responses first, and then Gretchen will also put there. She's in the middle as the victim to defend her stance. So we've got a great mix. That's what we're aiming for. We're aiming here to have a nice mix of people, and we're delighted that CRASSH has succeeded in doing so. So first of all, we have Bhaskar. Bhaskar, I'm sure is known to all of you. He's in the geography department. He was he's been involved in the MEA and particularly the NEA. He wrote the last chapter of the NEA and is heading up the Research Institute as part of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. He's going to give us some of his thoughts. Bhaskar.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Gretchen, for the opportunity to respond. It's been a pleasure to hear you expand on a lot of your work over the last 3 lectures, and I'm looking forward to finally you getting the chance to converse with us. You invited us throughout your 3 lectures to interrupt you, and none of us did. We were being polite and possibly British and decided not to interrupt you. So hopefully this will be the opportunity for you to have an exchange of ideas and views, which is what you've been looking forward to. So I hope this afternoon works. Can I also do a sort of show of hands question here, which is how many of you have not attended any of the 3 previous lectures? Or I could ask it in the other way if that's going to embarrass you, which is how many of you attended at least one of the previous 3 lectures? Okay, so a large majority, but not every hand went up, and I won't look in particular directions. But I don't want to obviously go over the sort of rich areas that Gretchen covered in the 3 lectures that have taken place. I'm going to pick up on the issues that I've been particularly interested in myself, which were the subject of some of Gretchen's interventions, that are still unresolved in my mind. I think we might benefit from a wider discussion around them. And of course, this is my personal take rather than sort of a reasoned collective response to all of the multiple ideas that you came through with. So with that disclaimer that this is a sort of partial reading of a very rich set of questions that we could go in multiple directions with, I'll talk in some detail. So we with our first sort of question around natural science, social science, humanities, and the others, have already touched upon the interdisciplinarity that is inherent in the kinds of things that Gretchen's interested in. And the fact that people are sitting together and talking about these issues suggests that that interdisciplinarity is very important. In her first lecture, Gretchen sort of laid out some ideas around that interdisciplinarity. She was talking about two questions that, in a sense, animated natural science. How does the system work, and what is possible? She also said that the social sciences are concerned with the same two questions, how a system works and what is possible. And then talked about the humanities, asking, if you like, another set of questions, which is what matters and what is fair. And I thought that was an interesting characterization. I put my hand up identifying myself as a social scientist, but I think I'm concerned about the questions about what matters and what is fair. So I'd like possibly to have some discussion around that delineation. No delineation can ever be perfect, but whether questions of fairness are appropriate for the domain of knowledge that we classify as social science, whether that is the kind of thing that social scientists should be concerning themselves with, or should they be letting that kind of discussion take place in other realms of other disciplines. It's a question which I'm unsure about. I certainly care about it deeply personally. I think some of my intellectual questions address that question as well. Certainly the approach that we widely characterize as political economy or political ecology asks questions around distributional justice, who are the winners and losers from particular interventions. And I think underpinning that are questions around fairness that potentially social scientists might be well equipped to deal with. So I'd like us to talk a little bit about that question around fairness. I'm going to illustrate this further with one of my three substantial points. I was also interested in that first lecture in questions around identity and values and the sort of competing ways in which people see three related parts of what they do: the ecosystem itself, the ecosystem-related practices, and the identity. And you illustrated this with your Hawaii examples in that first lecture, and how those overlapping circles sometimes were completely disconnected from each other, and in some cases overlapped completely. And those competing worldviews are really interesting for us to think about, and again, trying to think about how we might address those. So I'm sort of starting out by saying these are a few things that I found particularly compelling to think through. I'd like to talk, since I only have 10 minutes, about three specific questions, which I'd like to help us to think through. So coming back to fairness, when we intervene in relationships between people who are engaged with the management and use of ecosystems, a lot of the ways in which we might want to think about that relationship is perhaps in an externality context, that there are particular users whose activities impact more than their own personal well-being. It impacts on society's well-being, or impacts particularly on the well-being of somebody else. That's a classical externality situation. My actions, I'm a smoker, might have a negative impact on your health. That's the sort of classic kind of example that's used. Now, when we think about externalities, we have to think about how best we should respond to them. And a lot of the ecosystem service interventions are thinking precisely about that sort of externality situation. You have an upstream community that might change particular resource use practices, and in doing so, alter their impact upon a river system which is potentially supplying 9 million residents in a large city downstream. So there's an externality underpinning that relationship, and there is a service that's being delivered to this particular consumer group at the end of the system. And we're trying to incentivize a change in behavior which prevents that externality from being visited upon the victims of that externality. But we use that particular relationship often in designing interventions which seem to work with the principle of fairness. It's fair that a rich city like New York pays relatively less affluent landowners to change their land use practices, because it would be unfair to expect them to change that land use practice without some compensation. If you reversed my situation and you found that the upstream user was the local Coca-Cola bottling plant, should New York City pay Coca-Cola not to pollute its water. Is that a fair transaction? Or should that company be expected to leave the river free of pollution? Is it appropriate for the victim to pay the perpetrator of the crime not to be mugged or murdered? So what's the fairness question underpinning some of those reciprocal externalities? There is a victim and there's a polluter. But in a lot of the examples that we're aware of in the ecosystem services world, the direction of payment works in the kind of moral universe we'd like to inhabit, which is that the poorer provider of ecosystem services is getting paid by a richer beneficiary of those ecosystem services. But if that relationship were reversed, and if the beneficiary of ecosystem services were less well off, and the perpetrator of the crime, as it were more affluent, would it be appropriate to ask a poor slum community in India to pay the Coke bottling plant not to pollute the water? So I see the relationship as being the same. I see the examples that we've got in the literature as being ones that fit with the way we'd like to work. But we are actually making judgments around fairness when we're making these interventions. And I'd like us to discuss that. So that's sort of my first point, that reciprocal externalities are two-way. There's a perpetrator and a victim, and trying to decide on the direction of payment is in itself an intervention in our judgments about fairness. Payment for ecosystem services in some ways reverses the polluter pays principle, and should we discuss that? The second set of issues that really came alive for me in the second lecture was on the scale of some of these interventions. China in particular, of course, is just staggering to see the scale and ambition of some of the programs that Gretchen was talking about. And someone from the audience, I think it was Nigel, asked the question, how do you get traction in that kind of context? And your response was instructive, and it's something which I've been thinking about as well, which is the role of knowledge brokers seems to be really important. You pointed to a particular intermediary who happened to be positioned in certain ways to provide policy advice. And I think that strand resonated yesterday as well in your third lecture, where someone asked you about how do you get people to engage in these issues. And you said, actually, it's really important to get the key decision makers on board and work with them, because actually, in some ways, none of us have enough time to engage everybody. And that was interesting, because it's clear that that's the way the world works. There are avenues of influence which particular knowledge brokers are well placed to actually take forward. Particular sorts of knowledges then find their ways into particular sorts of policy interventions. And the issue that potentially raises in my mind is what gets left out from those pathways. Particular types of knowledge which might not have as much traction with those particular knowledge brokers. Is there a risk that particular types of knowledge are being neglected relative to other types of knowledge? What about a sort of widespread belief that participatory processes that are inclusive and bring everyone into the room are desirable ways to go, more democratic ways to go, rather than the pathways which might pick particular ways of doing things? And is there a tension here? I'm not sure if there is, but it's just something which potentially troubles me, that, if I happen to have strong influence with individual pathways to particular policy outcomes, am I filtering my selective knowledge and bias into a policy impact? And what worries me, I think, is what if I got it wrong? What if the intervention that I'm proposing actually is founded on less than complete understanding of the situation? We never really have a full understanding. And we encourage people to take steps which in 2 years turn out to be not delivering the outcomes that they expected. Might we run the risk of them losing faith in that particular type of intervention? So an example from my own work, I've been working in the North Indian state of Himachal Pradesh, where there's a small town we were working in, where they decided that they would pay an upstream village to protect a part of the catchment, because they thought that's where the spring that supplies the town drinking water gets recharged from. So the intervention was to pay the village not to use that part of the forest, and the municipal council from the town is making the payment. So it's a sort of fairly familiar payment for ecosystem services intervention. What troubles me, and this intervention happened before our team started working in the area, is that the hydrological basis of deciding which catchment protection area they should actually put into place, which particular part of the watershed should be protected, was based on a 12-hour visit by a hydrologist who was flown in from southern India, who walked around and sort of said, yes, I think it's that one. And the intervention has now been put into place. The town expects fully that in 3 or 4 years' time, they will see the benefits in terms of cleaner or more secure drinking water. But what if it doesn't come through? And what's the risk with that kind of... So what happened was that the team which placed the intervention had very good traction with the town council and was able to get them to agree that this was a good thing to experiment with. But what if it's wrong? And that slightly worries me. The third one, and I know I'm running out of time, is a different tack altogether. And again, this came up in conversation in response to yesterday's seminar, yesterday's lecture. This was the discussion around what if an alternative comes along? What if we don't need the bees any longer for pollination? And there are technological alternatives. But also connecting this with your earlier very interesting discussions around the mental health outcomes. What if the Google Glass experience of being in nature actually is, for our mental well-being, as beneficial as the real thing? What if the virtual reality world becomes as good as the natural world? And the mental health well-being impacts that have been documented are actually discernible through that virtual reality world. Does that mean that we stop valuing nature in its natural form? And you responded yesterday, and I share your response, but I thought it was worth more discussion, so I've thrown it in as one of my 3 points by saying that surely we shouldn't put, to paraphrase, all our eggs in that basket. We're not only valuing bees because they pollinate. It's an additional dimension to our argument. It isn't the sole argument. Similarly, we don't only value nature because of the aesthetic experience of being in nature. And if Google Glass replaces that bit of our experience, there are other reasons to care about nature. And I think that's sort of, in effect, what you were saying in response to that question. But I think that is a larger discussion. If the main reason that we value a particular part of nature is because of a specific service that it provides us, and then a technological alternative comes along which might potentially provide that same service more cheaply, what does that do in terms of our arguments in favor of nature? And is there a potential risk that those arguments will then be undermined?
Oh, I feel like responding to all these, but I, more than that, want to hear the discussion, so I'll mainly be listening. But one quick thing in response there is that, many people have worried that it's protected areas that will never be sufficient to achieve even just purely biodiversity-focused objectives of, quote, saving nature for nature's own sake. So just for the broad audience here, I wanted to point out that with, say, 11-12% of the land surface protected, the expectation is that over time, that might protect or save, 3 to 5% of the other species that are on the planet, that were here when humanity became a big force. So a protected area strategy alone seems highly unlikely to serve well in just the instance of sort of protecting nature for her own sake. And that's one major motivation for trying to open up other strategies, quite apart from sort of the value to humanity even of the other strategies. So that's often not mentioned. But to respond more broadly on Simon's earlier point and the good discussion that followed, I felt confronted with the issue of fairness, at the opening moment of getting involved in any of these efforts. And scientists, we often don't talk so much about what motivates our own work. We sort of pretend that we're operating, in some purely rational realm, unaffected by, the values we've grown up with and such. And it couldn't be further from the truth. So in choosing what we work on, we're making a statement about our values. And in step one, in undertaking the work, we're making statements. So I think the discussion we're having about fairness and how to frame it and what dimensions we ought to be thinking really deeply about, and with what sorts of approaches from different realms is really critical, at least for people to be well versed in. Whether they're the ones using these modes of analysis and tools and things is somewhat separate, but we ought to all be a lot better versed in this sort of ways of thinking and history and such than I feel we tend to be. And certainly in my own case, I haven't felt sufficiently equipped.
It is a great privilege to have the chance to participate in this discussion and to have this time together, Gretchen. I've really appreciated your 3 talks. 3 things in particular that I've appreciated about them has been the breadth of the dimensions, different disciplinary dimensions that you've brought to a problem and a set of problems, be they the balance of values or the balance of trying to conserve nature and improve the benefits of agriculture for people at different scales, are often conceptualized through quite narrow lenses. I've appreciated as well the conceptual framing that you've brought. I think a lot of times we work in relative isolation of any logical conceptual relationship about how the work that we're doing, the contributions that we're making, links to other contributions, and the broader, whether at the very crude humanities versus social and natural sciences, or the more detailed kind of systems model of how decisions filter around to impacts and changing behavior. And I've also appreciated your call for practicality, and you mentioned a number of times, particularly yesterday, that there are certain questions that we just don't have the time to answer. And I think we are often quite delusioned in thinking that certain realms of science are of critical importance to addressing some of these big challenges. And in theory, they would be, but we really don't have time. So I think that recognition, that kind of humility that you've brought to a lot of these framings, I've really appreciated. I would like to contribute with 2 sets of thoughts. One more specifically on a broadening, if you like, of the set of issues that I think we should be thinking about regarding the content of trying to reconcile conservation and agricultural benefits in these mosaic human-dominated landscapes that we work in. I work a lot in the Brazilian Amazon, to state my background. So issues that I know that you appreciate and also work on, but just to broaden the discussion a little. And then secondly, to step back and try and provoke us into thinking about, given this immense complexity and given the huge range of issues that we're grappling with, I fundamentally feel that we need to be much more strategic and have a much more critical appraisal of the contributions that science is making, that social sciences are making, that humanities are making. How can we be more strategic about our approach without undermining the critical intellectual freedoms that of course underpin the way in which science should be allowed to progress, that thinking and knowledge production generally should be allowed to progress and flourish. So how do we grapple that tension? And I'm going to propose a few ways in which we can perhaps think about that and have an architecture for trying to improve the strategy within which our work is done, without at the same time compromising the value of it. So briefly on the first aspect, with regards to broadening the discussion around reconciling agriculture and biodiversity conservation and the protection of these regulatory and services that come from natural habitats that are interspersed across agricultural landscapes, is that I think a lot more appraisal is needed of the huge amount of heterogeneity that we can see in natural systems, the native areas of remaining vegetation. So the work that we've done in Brazil, one of the most striking conclusions that we've found so far is the huge degree of heterogeneity due to the juxtaposition of impacts from logging, from fragmentation, from fire, from defaunation of large mammals over the last century or so. And the combination of that maelstrom of assaults on the natural system has led to, unless you get into the detail, a seemingly imperceptible level of variability, of heterogeneity within the remaining areas of forest. So a lot of the comparisons that you made and that we often make, I myself, are often comparing between patches of native forest with different agricultural systems. but the heterogeneity within the native systems that remain is of huge importance to understanding what those comparisons actually mean. And I think there's three aspects that we need to recognize in that regard. One is that these systems, whether it be in Brazil, whether it be in Costa Rica, in many parts of the world, are undergoing an extraordinary degree of change. The flux is just huge. I mean, where I work is a particular example. Many of the people that live and occupy the landscapes where I work in the eastern Brazilian Amazon have only been there for a couple of generations. So it's a kind of a kaleidoscopic landscape that's whistling through different states, and the changes that have happened in the last few decades inside just the remaining areas of forest have been really quite profound. And the legacy effects of those impacts on how we understand extant patterns, for example, of biodiversity, are also quite profound. So we've been quite surprised at the extent to which, for example, including measurements of historical change and dynamics in models, statistical models of contemporary patterns of biodiversity have been quite useful in understanding what we're seeing now. So we're not looking at a static world, we're looking at a very dynamic world, and that dynamism is often playing out in very subtle ways in remaining areas of native habitat. Secondly, we need to think about our choices of the reference state, if you like, against which we measure impact and change. And when that choice is limited, we've done these analyses with our data. You could choose an area that's been logged twice and burnt 3 times. And in terms of ecological condition, no matter how really you wish to measure it, whether it's the fertility of the soil or the total stock of carbon or the number of forest-dependent bird species, it's probably in a poorer condition than a secondary regenerating forest of 40 or 50 years. So you can get very different implications and tell a very different story. And you could do that strategically if you wish, depending on your choice of baseline. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, is I think we need a much greater effort, as I know some of the work in Costa Rica is trying to do, to bring together more integrated approaches to managing and incentivizing change in both the agricultural areas and the forested areas, or whatever the landscape may be, grasslands, dry forests, savannas. So they're on the table at the same time. And with regards to this, I mean specifically efforts to try and curtail and avoid further degradation through fire or through logging. The legislation in Brazil is almost exclusively focused on protecting forest area. And that leads to very economically inefficient mechanisms for trying to reconcile some of these trade-offs. If money, instead of retiring an area of production, allowing it to recover into native vegetation, sometimes it would be a lot more effective if the cost of that, the opportunity cost of that that's borne by the landowner, was paid or partly paid into a pot of money that could support a fire brigade service in the local region to prevent wildfires from breaking out, that really are the spark that will drive that potential tipping point that many of us are worried about in the Amazon shifting towards a more shrub-dominated biome. And secondly is efforts to rehabilitate these degraded native vegetation, areas of native vegetation. So we're working with a team that's doing some enrichment planting of patches of forest, and that gives an economic revenue stream over time for the farmer that can be matched with whatever he or her is doing in the farmed area. So how can we have more integrated, coupled strategies? So moving swiftly on, the second set of observations, kind of much broader, I would like to provoke us all to think about, is in this issue of stepping back and recognizing that we have really limited resources, both in terms of time, in terms of money, but also in terms of expertise. We're grappling with deeply challenging conceptual issues. How do we best align and apportion that limited resource in order to deal with the problems in the time with which they need to be dealt with? So I'm generally calling for a greater emphasis on strategy and appraisal, and what I really appreciated about many of the points you made, Gretchen, is a real evidence of trying to do this in partnership with local and national actors, of identifying some of these key issues from the get-go, like issues of fairness. So they're not tagged on at the end. They don't just derail the whole process and then it gets ignored because people felt disempowered and ignored. So I'm going to suggest perhaps 3 areas where we can try and think about a more strategic apportioning of effort in our research, in our thinking, in our contribution from the humanities, from law, from all of these different dimensions. One is in the disciplinary work. So we've talked a lot about production function models. So whether it's of a hydrological service or whether it's of set of cultural services, so production function in the very broadest sense. Levins, a population biologist in 1966, had a nice paper that had a profound effect on many of us biologists, but I think the implications are general, where he said all models have issues of manageability, generality, reality, and precision. And there are inherent tensions and trade-offs between those. And I think one of the things that you've made clear is that we shouldn't be overly bothered about generality. We need models that are relevant to a given place. We're not managing the world, we're managing places. They need to be manageable by people that will actually operate them. But there is this tension between reality and precision. So how can we, you also mentioned at one point that you've stepped back in some of the complexity of the individual models that you've been using and realized that actually you can get away with making quite useful judgment calls with even simpler models. But oftentimes the traditional kind of structure of incentives and momentum of research communities, traditional incentives, doesn't really allow for that. In fact, it flows in the opposite direction. So often the sunk costs of intellectual investment, of financial investment, very much carry forwards in arguing the case, even if perhaps you don't believe it to be true offline, that you must be tightening the notch of that set of variables even tighter in order to, and that's incredibly important, set against other things that you could be doing. So how can we identify, if you like, stopping rules for where we should say, I know that Paul Ehrlich has said in the Millennium Assessment for Human Behaviour that what we need now is a transformational shift towards the social sciences and the humanities. And a lot of these natural science questions that we've been focusing on more or myself in my career are of diminishing importance. So how can we play those out? And I think there's 3 dimensions of choice or motivation that we should think about regarding those stopping rules, and they can be dug down a lot deeper in discussion, and they will be utility. What's the value of a particular piece of learning? And that's lots of different ways. How accessible is it to policymakers? Is it a significant problem? How general is that problem? What's the necessity of learning? Do we already know it? Is it really necessary to go further into this? And what's the feasibility of learning? Often a good example, I think, is the work you highlighted on biodiversity ecosystem function relationships. It's enormously complicated. It's almost infinitely complicated, and we just won't get there in time. Trying to disentangle the relative importance of a specific species or group of species to a specific function and how that then plays out to an actual service and an actual benefit that we accrue is probably impossible. So how can we balance that? Secondly, an area where I think we need to be a bit more strategic is the understanding of complex systems. So you've presented and used to great effect a kind of constellation of individual models to do with certain elements of production, certain elements of interaction. But as I know you appreciate, there's a world of kind of non-linear change and feedbacks and positive and negative feedbacks that are very, very poorly quantified in empirical models. And there's groups who are leading thinking on this. So the Stockholm Resilience Centre, where Gretchen's currently based for 2 years, have contributed a lot of this. But a lot of it is very high on concepts and relatively low on content. It's just simply because these are very, very hard things to do, but we can't ignore them. So how do we balance that? How do we bring in qualitative approaches that recognize and help us understand and elicit complexity and feedbacks into these quantitative models? And finally, and touching on a few of the things that Bhaskar raised, is you presented, Gretchen, what I quite like, this very simple framing that's nevertheless very useful in trying to support a process of change. So 4 steps of co-development of knowledge, co-development of tools, implementation of real-world management changes, if you like, and then scaling up and replication. So when I think, conservation science, for example, is a discipline that's been focused very much on biodiversity conservation, I think is focused very much on those first 2, with very little lip service to the co-part of the knowledge and tool development. And we've done very badly at taking a more strategic and research and thinking-based approach to the second 2, which is the implementation side, which is also an object of research in its own right, of course, and the scaling up side. You mentioned yourself that often the success of implementation is best determined by perhaps chance events or certain leaders. But how can we elaborate a bit more of a conceptual framework of the aspects that make up the solution side of the equation? So we've done pretty well on the problem side. The natural scientists have articulated all sorts of problems that we have to deal with. You could argue that we know enough about those to really get our teeth into solving them to some extent. So how can we break that down? And I would argue that there are a cascading set of issues that flow from identification of a certain set of options and thinking through scenarios that can encourage us to be more clear about the context of our work and more explicit as well about the kind of experiential and epistemological underpinnings. So if you are proposing a set of changes, a set of different scenarios, what are the conditions by which we assume that those changes will actually take hold and run? So it's a lot of aspects to do with the institutional work that I know your team has done a lot of work on, but through lack of time perhaps didn't have much chance to elaborate on them in the lectures. And then, given a set of conditions, we need to think ahead of time, not retrospectively, as to what are the risks. There are always risks. There's a lot of work that's done in risk analysis through business and operations research. What are the risks associated, social and ecological, with a particular idea or proposition of how we could change the system for the better to address a particular problem that's drawn from a particular set of known vulnerabilities in social or ecological attributes? So what are the risks? And thirdly, what are the kind of social and ecological resilience implications that this new system that's being envisaged may persist in the long term? Is the whole thing predicated on the price of coffee? So it's putting your eggs in the same basket problem again. A lot of times we rush forwards in articulating a problem, we parameterize it to death, and then we think of a limited number of scenarios because there's really not much scope for analyzing too many. And then the process then takes on a much more ad hoc, inevitably ad hoc kind of lurching type behavior that's harder to study and much less studied. So how can we be more strategic about following it through in advance of these changes? And the final comment I just wanted to make is there's a tremendous emphasis that I absolutely applaud on the co-nature of the need with which work needs to be done. So co-development of knowledge, co-development of tools. I spent the best part of a year doing nothing but talking to farmers in Brazil, rich and poor farmers. I was told by a few people that this was academic suicide. Hasn't killed me yet, but it is hard. And the current incentive structure, changing a little bit, Britain now has a focus on impact, real impact, whatever that is. It's experimental in its assessment of research excellence. But how do we really shift the system towards a set of incentives and mechanisms? So I would ask you, Gretchen, and the room as a whole, if we had magic wands, what would be not only the changes in the incentive structure, but the actual mechanisms by which we can embed ourselves reciprocally between and amongst policy, practice and research communities, so that we're exposed on a more iterative basis to these cycles of learning and doing that we often just look at from a long perspective. So what would some of those ideas be, and how feasible really are they?
I'll just jump in briefly to follow on these really good comments and say that my impression is that the standards have really shifted, and that now the expectation is that you do just as you said. It still can be very difficult, but in all of the work in which the Natural Capital Project is engaged, a strength of it, and there's also a weakness to this, but a strength is that the team is invited in, and it's at the level at which decision making is happening, and where there are a lot of connections to community. And to your point from China, there are always local people who speak the local language, and a real mix of people on a team. They're people of all kinds of backgrounds, academic and non-academic, to make any progress. So that's a strength. It's also a real challenge in a whole bunch of ways. To Toby's point, it takes a long time to develop those sorts of teams and to function effectively, and it's very risky often in a training context if we're thinking about master's projects or PhD projects and the way universities operate now. It's very hard to just sort of get slotted into a project and get your footing and all that. So I feel we need to rethink and revise some of the expectations of degree granting programs. What are the standards now? And if we're trying to move from knowledge generation through to the use and actual kind of co-development of knowledge, in an iterative process, it requires a lot, and it's easy to kind of discount that in different ways, especially by people in academic institutions who haven't engaged in that themselves. So there's a sort of a leading edge of change. And then there are a lot of people who'd like to be supportive, but who just are not familiar with the challenges of the work and the many skills and the depth of experience required to be effective. But I think your point is really well taken, and I feel discussing further what kind of sort of a systems view of how we can advance in some collective ways really productively. There are a million problems we could all work on at the interfaces of our interests and disciplines and things, but are there some really key things that we ought to be thinking about, maybe with fairness in mind to future generations? What are the number one, the top list of 10 things? Actually, I'm looking at you now. You'll do 100, but let's cut it back to 10. What are the most important areas in which bringing, we only have so much time that we're going to invest in thinking about stuff collectively and so on, but to shape what would the real state of the art be in a dream world in 10 or 20 years, or sooner, of training, of conducting this sort of work, of how we communicate it later, with whom, in what languages, and what ways. In the Hawaii work, this wonderful student worked with a local hula group, and there's a long explanation I could give of that, but it's the way of telling stories in Hawaii, and produced a whole show, but it took about a year of intensive work, and she took sort of a year longer than most in doing her thesis because she was so committed to bringing this back at whatever career cost. But we ought to be a lot more open about all this and discuss really specifically where we could head together to achieve much greater advances than we've been making to date.
So Partha we owe many things for, but including having inspired our speaker for today. He's well known to all of us, well known for his series of influential papers and books, and of course he's a hugely influential economist, and now it's Partha's turn.
While he heads up there, we found out that Bhaskar was deprived of mentoring in that year when Partha was at Stanford, and he's still a little bit upset.
Well, but at my age, I become a student again, so it can be reciprocated. Well, we've just had a superb triplet of lectures, and what I thought I would do is to lift Gretchen's analysis, and give you a picture. I assume there are no economists here, or the bulk of you are innocent of my subject, which is not a bad state of affairs to be, because I think I'm pretty persuaded that most of my colleagues are innocent of the subject too. Ours is a very powerful subject. It's a language which is flexible and essential, because no matter who you are, rich, poor, or middle-income person, material things matter. The goods and stuff out there, and the services we receive from them. And they are very often, of course, non-material themselves. A lot of my work has been to introduce natural capital into economic models, and it transforms the subject, believe me, and I'll give you an indication of how it does. But interestingly enough, natural capital, aside from perhaps subsoil resources, don't enter into the accounting framework and the mental constructs on the basis of which we study the economic universe. When I say we, I mean economists, policymakers. It's a great loss, that, because it essentially misleads. The intuition that we as citizens have about the way our societies operate, our reaction to them, the intuition that maybe something is not going right, other things are going well, those intuitions very often are correct. But the link between those intuitions and the public statistics that we are offered is very tenuous. And one of the things I've tried to do in my own work over the past 20 years has been to rectify that and see in skeletal form how an accounting system, which after all is there essentially to inform and to understand progress or regress of economies, will look if you do the things, at least in principle, correctly. It's extremely important to get the theory right. I am now speaking to perhaps humanities, where some of the conversation will be, of course, at the practical level, proximate. We've had emphasis on that aspect of things, how difficult it is, how approximate our knowledge is going to be when we have to act. Of course, that's true. But it's extremely important to know when you're making approximations, why you're approximating, where. You have to cut corners. Life is full of cutting corners. But you need to know that you are cutting a corner. And for that, theory is required. A good theory is required, one which is coherent and picks up the nuances of all the things that matter to you. But when you apply it, then, of course, you have to go and bathe in the Ganges every morning in order to cleanse yourself for all the nasty things you've done. And I will be showing you that. Okay, can I have the first slide? I think it's called nature. Yeah. Okay. Now, the first slide gives you the sense in which Gretchen has been lecturing to us. She has emphasized the fact that we're studying socio-environmental processes. Those of you who are slightly mathematically inclined will be, and you were a few minutes ago when you talked about complex systems. These processes typically will be modeled as dynamical systems in which humans enter, and of course nature enters, and so forth. Okay? That's the dynamical system. You also need to know initial conditions, what there is out there in the economy. And you need a conception of the economy's well-being, people's well-being, social well-being. Now, these are the three aspects, the three necessary pieces of information for being able to measure or estimate the social worth of assets, which is what, at some deep level, these lectures were about. Now, when I talk about an economy, you should know that an economy could be a family, a household, it could be a village, it could be a district, it could be a town, it could be a state, it could be a nation, it could be the world as a whole, depending on the context. So the things that I'll be talking about now can move from scale to scale. There's a parallel story to be told using the same conceptual background. You won't be compromising any of this. If you move from, say, a nation to a little village community, or to a group that is being studied by Toby or whoever. But data very often comes at the national level, and I was particularly interested in recent years to see how national income statistics would look if you bring nature into the exercise. 3 years ago, I was invited by the government of India to chair a commission to prepare a report on greening India's national accounts, and it was a prime ministerial directive, and I was quite happy to do that. It was a pleasure to do it. Our secretariat was the Indian government's statistical office, and the secretary was the chief statistician. So it worked very well. The report was submitted in April this year, and it gave a blueprint of how the kinds of information that you collect about the economy and transmit, and then also make decisions regarding what to do, what kind of projects to go for. All the things that Gretchen is talking about is really embedded in the kind of framework that we proposed. And what I want to do here for the next 5 minutes is essentially to use that to give you some numbers. Now, this is when you really need to go to the Ganges for cleaning up, because these numbers are totally illustrative, but it gives you a flavor of how an economy looks very different if you take things that matter to us around this table are taken seriously. Okay? So can I have the... Gretchen talked about the productive base. She talked about natural capital, and she wanted to talk about natural capital on a footing with manufactured capital, health, education, and so forth. So we'll be thinking of a productive base as being a compilation of the capital assets the economy holds. Now here I'm thinking of an economy, but, I'm thinking of a nation, but of course, as I said, you could scale it down to even a village level. A village has a productive capacity. It has trees, ponds, and so forth and so on, and people. It trades. And you want to know whether this village is progressing or regressing. And you want to see in what direction it's regressing, even while it's progressing in other directions. How do you break the productive base into its components is a question that's asked here, and is answered by suggesting that there are produced capital, roads, buildings, machinery, and equipment, which are the main things in national accounts as they are constructed today. So if you look at the UK national accounts, one will be the really prominent thing. There will be subsidiary remarks about human capital, population size, composition, you have data on that. Knowledge and skills, you'll be talking about a proportion of people who are literate and so forth and so on, how many have had tertiary education. And of course you have data on health, longevity, and so forth. Natural capital, at least in the Indian context, Indian national accounts do not have very much to say about natural capital. And here, I think I would side with the natural scientists. Don't give up on the natural sciences. Without them, we are completely sunk. At the moment, the Indian government has very little mapping even, other than forest cover, because that's cheap. You get photographs, but forest cover, of course, is covering an enormous amount of information which was being transmitted by Gretchen gave us a flavor of how much you'll be losing by simply thinking of forest cover. But at the moment, that's all we have to work with. Ecosystems, subsoil resources, and so forth. I won't go into the latter four. Today we are so dominant as a profession, we economists, that the moment you want to sell an idea, you call it a capital asset. So you have institutional capital, knowledge capital, social capital, religious capital, and so forth and so on. I want to keep them out of this bundle for a reason that I'll come to at discussion time if you have. Okay, can I have the next one? So what I'm going to do is to give you a paper that I co-authored with Kenneth Arrow, Larry Goulder, Kevin Mumford, and Kirsten Olsen. The latter two were graduate students when we started working, but they're now well into their careers. It took a long while to get this paper written because we had to do an enormous amount of theoretical work to seal the deal, as it were, in obtaining the numbers. What we have done is in this case, I want to talk about the composition of wealth per capita in India in 1995, in line with the breakdown of the capital assets that I talked about. Okay. That is natural capital, human capital, and manufactured capital. In national accounts, you will only get the manufactured capital or produced capital side of things. You will have subsidiary documents regarding human capital. Okay, now if you look at this, I won't really bother you with the way we have done it. But however, the one thing I would point out is that the method that we have used to value the objects, in line with the data that were available, were consistent with one another. Those of you who know the Human Development Index, for example, and some of you will have come across it, you will find there you have GDP, you have education, and you have health. But the way they're balanced, the trade-offs, which is so much a part of Gretchen's talk, those trade-offs were given on an ad hoc basis. And what we have tried to do over here is to found the trade-offs on the basis of the three-way classification that I made right at the beginning, which was the heart of Gretchen's talk, which is that you need to understand the processes, you need to have some notion of the initial distribution of assets, and you have, of course, have to have a notion of social well-being. All right. If you look at the numbers here, this is in 1995 US dollars. One thing stares at you in the face, which is what? Which is health totally dominates by 2 orders of magnitude. Now, if it surprises you, it should surprise you, because you would never have thought that if somebody says, what is the composition of wealth in an economy, Now, some people would say, of course, particularly politicians have always run with the argument, particularly in poor countries, that our wealth lies in our people. We've heard that. But you took it with a pinch of salt. You might say, well, what's the human capital component of the people? If you're very poor, you're in trouble. Turns out that people, the reason it's very, very high is because people care about their health. And we've developed this from value of longevity. And the way you do that, again, you have very, very approximate methods to doing it. You look at the premium people demand for taking additional risk of mortality. And it's reflected in wages. That appears even in the poorest countries. You find wage differentials amongst people of similar occupations, but with different risks of fatality. So in the building sites, of course, it's a good example of what that happens. From that, you can try and tease out how people value the risk of death, and then you can work that out. Now, it turns out human capital, health, absolutely dominates, swamps. Can I have the next one? Now, the only way to persuade governments that you have to take Gretchen's kind of work and the kind of work that we're discussing here really seriously is to look at to demonstrate the paucity of data. The only kind, in natural capital, the only kinds of capital assets we were able to include, because of a paucity of data, were subsoil resources. We included carbon because there have been estimates of the negative price of carbon in the atmosphere. We took $50 a ton as the mean of the range that we had seen. And then, of course, we've done sensitivity analysis, but that's not for today. We had land values, market prices, nothing on ecosystem services. For the simple reason that even if you have data on that at a very local level, we don't have it on a sufficiently large sample to be able to get a sense of how it's spread across the nation, and therefore taking an average. So that's a huge hole, and therefore the natural capital component of the can I have the previous slide? Sorry. The natural capital component, 2,300, is a estimate, is a underestimate, and in all probability, an incredibly low amount. It should be. I wouldn't like to guess. That would be cheating, and that's not right. But I'm talking about swaths of capital which are missing here. For example, water. That's not part of the natural capital in this because we don't have any data on it. Okay. All right. So if you then, what we did was to look at the change over 1995-2000 to get a sense of the change in wealth per capita. Why are we interested in that? Well, we're interested in that because we want to talk about sustainability. And the index with which one should discuss sustainability, and that can be proven, is an index of wealth. We want to look at the change in wealth as a per capita. And the distribution, but we can't handle distribution here at all because we don't have data on distribution of wealth. We have distribution of income, but that's very different from distribution of wealth. Okay, it turns out that the annual percentage rate of change of wealth has been at 0.4% during this five-year period. But of course, given the fact that natural capital is hugely underestimated, it's an alarmingly low figure. And it could easily be negative, and I would suspect it probably is, but I wouldn't wish to be on print with that because I can't prove it. I can't prove it with the elastic nature of the data. So I want to conclude that this is the framework which follows directly from Gretchen's talks. She was studying mechanisms, methods of trying to elicit agreement and trying to find out trade-offs between the competing needs that a society has, and at the national level, these are picking up the competing, the allocation of wealth, and at the margin, how you choose will depend on the nature of the project, and the prices you use will be the ones which were used for estimating these. This is very, very preliminary. This is very, very crude, but the theory of it is pretty much now airtight. These are theorems, so you can't contest theorems. You can contest an assumption in a theorem, of course. But the numbers, we have a long way to go. And it's very sad because in principle, we could have been, at least from the social science side, far in advance now if policymakers and economists had taken nature seriously. Thank you very much.